Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. Now, this period, in addition to gearing up to observe the birth of the Christ child or the new year, it finds many of us in a transition phase. It may be that you just finished school or another level of training while still on the job, and you may be unemployed or underemployed and preparing in advance so that you can make good on your New Year's resolution to plunge further into the world of work. Education Officer of the Human Resource Managers Association of Trinidad and Tobago, Rambhajan, she joins us once more in short order to help distill some of the points we should be paying attention to. And we want to say thank you once more for making the time, Ms. Rambhajan. But let's set this conversation. What are some of the reasons that we may have individuals gearing up to go further, to start? What are some of the situations that people may find themselves in while they're preparing for the world of work?
Okay, so well, as you rightly said, people may be on the tail end of, sometimes they're doing an academic course, some other kind of course or program, and they're getting ready. And, with the new year, we always think in terms of what am I going to do differently? How am I going to change my life, my New Year's resolutions? So people may be planning from that point. Also, what you're seeing, Dike, is that a number of people who would have not necessarily chosen to, but may have had to transition during the COVID period, they're now getting back into really job hunting, or at least looking for a job on their own terms. Many persons would have been put out of employment, let me put it that way, and they may have remained unemployed, or they may have taken up a job, simply taking whatever job they could get. But people are trying to get back into, I'm seriously job hunting, and I'm looking at getting my career back on track. So these are some of the things that you have happening, people launching back into the world of work after the COVID period, people transitioning from school into work, and then of course it's the new year, and let's see how I'm going to do things differently. How will I prepare myself for the job market?
So prepare, and I like the way that you ended that statement, preparing yourself for the job market. What are some of those things that are the givens that sometimes there's so much of understood something that it may be oversights at times where people say, oh shucks, I should have done that too.
Okay, great. And Dike, whenever I talk about preparing yourself for the job market, and then of course we can talk about preparing yourself for interviews, I can really cut the preparation into two categories. There's the mental preparedness, and then there's also the physical preparedness in terms of facing the job market. So let me tackle the mental preparedness first. If you've been out of work, or you've been in a job that's not really a job that you want to see yourself staying in for a while, or you're just out of school, you just finished a program, and you're jumping in to, get back in there, you're going to be vying for others for the job that you really have your eyes set on, then you have to prepare yourself mentally. What do I mean by that? A number of things. The first thing you have to recognize is when you are going out there and you are sending out applications and resumes, you need to understand that cover letter, as we used to call it long ago, the application letter, the resume or CV that you're putting together, that is your first impression with the organization. It is actually how the organization first meets you. So that you need to put some time and effort into really thinking through, how do I want to present myself on people? So part of that, putting the resume together, is really a lot about introspection in terms of, how do I see myself? How do I want to present myself? What do I want to say about myself? What are the things that I want for myself? So there is the matter of the resume. And then preparing yourself now, if you started to send out applications, send out resumes, and you are awaiting to be called for interviews, then mental preparedness also has to take place. And it goes from as simple as understanding what is an interview. Now, when we talk about interviews could be set up in a number of different ways. I could be called in for an interview and it's just going to be a one-on-one conversation that I'm having with someone physically. I could be actually called into a workplace, or I might be facing what we call a panel. I'm going to be interviewed, but I'm being interviewed by 3 persons or 4 persons. What can also happen is that in this day and age and after COVID, when you're called for an interview, it could also be a virtual interview, so that I'm going to be meeting someone on Zoom or on Teams. And again, it could be a panel on Zoom or Teams, or it could be one-on-one. I also like to encourage people to recognize that more and more, if you are called in for an interview, and I'm doing the air quotes, if you are called in for an interview, there is a chance that the interview is really not even an interview. And what do I mean by that, Dike? It means that you could be called in really for an assessment, which could take the form of what we call a psychometric assessment. It more looks at things in terms of your behaviors, or it can be an assessment in terms of your actual ability to reason and use your logic. So it could be more along the lines of questions that look more like mathematical questions or comprehension. Or you can be asked to do a presentation or do a case study or work with a group of people to come up with a solution to a problem, so that the interview isn't necessarily the interview that you might be thinking about in terms of sitting across the table and answering a question about where do I see myself in the next 5 years. So when you are called into an organization to do an assessment, or they may even use the word interview, it isn't necessarily that kind of discussion. So you have to prepare yourself mentally for the fact that you're not too sure what you're going to meet when you go out there. And that's the first part of the mental preparedness. Apart from that, Dike, one of the real pieces of information that you have to sit and work at has to do with, who am I? Now, that's a famous question when doing interviews, and I've done hundreds of interviews in my life. That's a hard question. When you throw that question out to candidates, sometimes candidates start to sweat. They're fanning. They look like if they're getting faint, they need a glass of water. That's a hard question that sometimes stumps people. Tell me a little bit about yourself, Dike. That kind of question, which typically happens at the start of the interview, can really throw people. So in preparing for an interview, you really have to sit down and ask yourself, who am I? What do I want to say about myself? And sometimes that's a hard question because, as humans, sometimes we spend a lot of time thinking about who other people are and what we think about them. And we don't always do that introspection. So sometimes we now have to ask ourselves, well, how do I behave in different situations or circumstances? How do people see me? How would people describe me? How would past colleagues describe me? How would past employers describe me? Who really am I? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What are the things that I'm good at? What are the things that I enjoy? So that preparation that I'm talking about, even before it reaches the stage of jotting down notes, pen on paper, whether you're using the technology to help you to take notes, it's really about casting an inward glance and really asking yourself, who am I?
And looking
So
at that
that's a
self
big-
and looking at that self-audit, I want us to take a short break, and it always comes to this, sir. So hold on. Before you go further, let's take a short break. We're speaking with Bunny Rambhajan, Education Officer at HERMAT, and we come back with so much more. We are gearing up to get into interviews. We're looking for different job opportunities, but putting ourselves in the best place to do so. Stay with us for the rest of this conversation. Welcome back. We are speaking with HERMAT Education Officer Bunny Rambhajan. We're looking at practices, the way that we can prepare to get into the world of work or to deepen our foothold in the world of work. And we were just speaking about preparing for interviews, looking at it from a mental standpoint, looking at doing self-audits, being able to articulate what it is you bring to the table. And I really like that point that you made, Ms. Rambhajan, about who am I? Because many times, like you said, people will be studying who other people are, but then there's also the caveat that people may be characterizing themselves by what they are not. So say, well, I's not that, I don't do this, but at the same time, being able to just speak to who you are is something that can pose challenging, especially when you haven't gone through the reps. And there are individuals who, they can do the work, give them the assignment, they can implement. But to talk about it, especially if they're not, one of the things that, even when people talk, because I don't necessarily do the best interview myself, but preparing yourself, because in front of this person or this panel of individuals who are literally going to judge you and speak to whether or not they want you as part of their organization. Are there ways that we can get ourselves a little more comfortable with that feeling or those feelings that we may be going through, getting ready for that?
Excellent. So I'm going to jump back into talk about mental preparedness, but I want to answer your question directly. And there's only one way to make yourself more comfortable before that actual day. And let me just say that I read somewhere a long time ago that right up there with dealing with death and divorce, going to an interview is right up there in terms of one of the things that make people really scared and uncomfortable, unhappy, stressed out. So it's not uncommon that people feel very stressed out about having to go to interviews. What's the key? There's no magic formula. And the key is simply this: preparation, preparation, preparation. It doesn't mean that being very prepared will mean that you're not nervous at all, but the more you prepare, the more comfortable you're going to be. So just getting back into that mental preparedness, and I like how you said it, apart from asking yourself, well, who am I? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Yeah, the question is, what do I bring to the table? How can I add value to this organization? And one of the things I remind people is that when you get to the interview stage, your qualifications don't really matter that much anymore. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if you've applied for a job, you saw an ad, the ad asked for 5 O levels. You have 5 O levels and you applied for this job. Then when you're actually being interviewed, your trump card can never be, well, I have 5 O levels. Because guess what? Every other person who was shortlisted, or let me use another phrase, every other person who's being let through that first gate to get into the interview also has the same qualification that you do. So you really have to ask yourself, what is it that I bring? What is it that I can do? How can I add value that might be a little bit different from what the other person can bring? And these are not answers that you can just come up with on the spot during an interview unless you've thought them through. Yeah. So a big part of the mental preparedness is about who am I? What do I bring? My strengths, my weaknesses. But part of the mental preparedness is also asking yourself, well, I'm going into an interview to have a conversation. Who's the other party? Who is the organization? The organization that I'm about to meet, what are they about? What do they think? What do they value? And you will hear organizations talking about their core values. Where's the organization headed? What do they do? What business are they in? And when we talk about what business is a business in, I mean, what do they make or what do they do? So I have to also do my research into that business that I'm going to meet. Yeah, I'm representing myself, but there will be a panel of persons or one person who's going to be representing the business, but what's that business about? And I have to spend enough time getting to know that business. Yeah. So that's also part of the mental preparedness. Apart from that, I also have to ask myself things like this. I have my qualifications. I know what the organization is about, but is there something that employers in general are looking for at this point in the history of the world? So what are the things that employers are looking for? Do I have those competencies? So are employers looking for people who work well in teams? Are employers looking for people who know how to speak well? Are employers looking for people who know technology? Are employers looking for people who know how to work cooperatively in teams, but also know how to work without direct supervision? What are employers looking for in people? Because the things that they are looking for, those are the kinds of questions they're going to ask me questions along those lines. So, what is it that they might be looking for when they're going to engage me in that conversation? So, that too has to be part of the mental preparedness. Now, I do want to introduce, I know it's a short conversation, but I do want to introduce your audience to two ideas that they can then do some further research on. There's a very popular way of doing interviews. Now it's a modern way of doing interviews, and it's called the CBI approach. CBI. And CBI means competency based interview. Competency based interview. The CBI also stands for three other things: circumstances, behaviors, and impacts. Now, it sounds like something fancy. It's really something very simple. But what it means is that when you go to an interview where people are doing competency-based interviews, they are going to be asking you questions to find out about if you have the competencies for the job, but they're going to be asking you the questions in such a way that they want you to talk about a circumstance you were actually in, how you behaved, and what was the impact of your behaviors. So, for example, if I want to know, Dike, about your teamwork, I'm not going to say, Dike, are you a good team player? Because Dike is never going to say that he's not a good team player. What I might ask, because teamwork is a competency, it's either a knowledge, skill, or ability that's very important to me as an employer. I'm going to ask Dike something like this. Dike, tell me about a time, that's a circumstance. Tell me about a time when you had to work in a team where you had a team member who was not pulling their weight. Yeah. So tell me about that circumstance. Walk me through it. Tell me what you did. That's where the behavior comes into play. And what you did or your behaviors, did they lead to success for the team? In other words, what were the impacts of your behavior? So in interviews like these, the interviewers are asking people to go back, walk backwards in their mind and go back to real incidents where they had to actually use the competencies we're looking for. And we want to hear about whether they were successful in using those competencies. And one of the reasons why these kinds of interviews are preferred, it's because, as I said before, if you ask people about, well, how would you behave if you're in a team? Or what do you usually do? People are very good at making up all kinds of fancy things that they think they will do when placed in a situation. But when a trained interviewer says, no, tell me about a real example, walk me through what really happened, people are forced to go back in their minds and pull up a real incident. So when preparing for interviews, you can also think about the interview preparation like this. What will they ask me about? Will they ask me about teamwork? Will they ask me about conflict and how I behave in conflict situations? Will they ask me about leadership? Will they ask me about whether I'm creative or innovative based on the type of job that I'm looking for? If it's a customer service job, will they be asking me about customer service? And can I look back in my memory? Can I walk backwards in my mind and think of situations where I really had to display these types of behaviors? And let me think up some stories that really happened that I may want to talk about when I get into the interview. So that's
and we
also
had plenty of things to talk about, and it feels as though you gave us all the answers to the test. But looking at the time, we're going to stop the conversation now. But hopefully you can stay with us for a little longer. So if people tune in via social platforms, they'll get the rest of the conversation. If not, thank you very much for tuning in. We've been speaking with Education Officer for Hermat, Bonnie Rambhajan, looking at getting into the world of work or changing our location whilst in the world of work. On behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us. So if you're looking at us now, you're looking at it on a digital platform. Thank you so much for staying with us. We're speaking with Education Officer for the Human Resources Managers Association of TNT, Bunny Rambhajan, and we're talking about getting into the world of work or increasing where you are, you're increasing your state rather in the world of work. And we got some fabulous insight into how it is you can prepare, because many times you'd find people undersell, but if they get through, it's almost as though they overperform, and then sometimes the people sound hell good on the interview, and then when you're inside, be like, but wait, no, like we boss on this one, but we can throw this one back in the sea. But thank you so much for what we've been speaking about. There are two things really I want us to look at now in this 10 minutes that we have. What are some of the factors to consider when taking a leap of faith? You're changing jobs, you might be changing industries, and how do you start to gear up for that?
Okay, so first of all, taking a leap of faith always means that there's some sort of risk involved, and that's something that people have to personally weigh out. One thing I always say to people is changing industries or changing jobs doesn't necessarily mean that you are jumping around. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you're not building on your career as is. So let me tell you what I mean. I've been in HR, but I may have been in different organizations. So I may have moved industries, but even as I moved from one job to the next, I was still building my HR portfolio. That being said, Dike, in this day and age, when we talk about a career, people are no longer talking about what they used to mean by career decades ago. Long ago, when we talked about a career, we were talking about one single ladder where you had to move up this ladder, and that was a career. Now you find that when people talk about career, they really mean careers, because it's not unusual for people to jump from one ladder to the next. In fact, now we talk about matrices, career matrices or career lattices, so that it is not unusual for people to, be in marketing 1 year, the next year they've moved on to HR, then they move into something into communications. That's not unusual. And young people are really being encouraged to explore as many careers as they would like to. So the risk really is for you to weigh for yourself, and also for you to think in terms of how is this building up my resume or my career in general? What will I learn when I make this switch? And how will that help me as I move along? Every place that I move to, what is it that I will be able to say that I have conquered, I've mastered? What new set of skills will I have that I can now take to the next job?
I think partly sometimes the issue is when people see them as isolated things. Because I think one, especially if something isn't highly, highly, highly specialized, so there's like one out of one, or just this person in a select group doing it. One, you find yourself interacting with persons, so that is something that you can take in terms of like some of those practices. And then also just looking at a workflow, how it is you'd get something, how it is you'd learn information. I think sometimes when we cut it off and we say, okay, well, this is very different from whatever, when we may have been making a lateral move and there's some things that there is carryover, if we choose not to see it, I think sometimes we set ourselves back. And or even because sometimes there will be some people that say that breadth gives you depth. So you're able to speak to a few things, look at them critically, and therefore synthesize new knowledge that you can take to this situation that you're in. Because like you said, you don't really have anybody getting a goal watch after 50 years anymore, as opposed to saying that there are many stops along the pathway of their career. But what are some of the other things that if there's someone who has not been in the labor force for some time, so even like when you look at, there's some people saying there's no place for old men, but wait now, they're not hired. I wonder if they'll hire somebody in my age bracket. They'll ask me why it is I've been out for so long, because this is even past COVID. How do you start to address an issue like that?
Yeah, so that's always a question, right? What do I do with the gaps on my resume? And has the world changed so much out there? Will I fit in? Well, the thing is, jumping back in will always provide some level of discomfort, again, with that introspection, really look back and see what have you been doing with your time. And I think this is more lesson for if persons that are listening as you move forward with your resume. Even when there are periods of downtime, you have to think about how can I use this time wisely so that I could talk about my learnings from this time when I go seeking a job in the future. The COVID period, everybody was at home. And I saw so many memes about, what will I say to the next employer when they ask me what did I learn during COVID? But that actually was a brilliant question because there were people who used their time very wisely. And I don't mean that you had to go out and get a degree or a fancy qualification. There were people who really set their mind to completing certain projects. They got into a whole realm of activities that they didn't know they were interested in before. I knew people who got into gardening, people who started taking care of animals and pets in a different way, people who completed home projects, So how do you use your time? And how do you value your own time? How do you use your time? And I think we have to see every single experience as a learning experience so that we can then talk about when you go to meet with prospective employers, the things that you have learned from your experiences, whether or not they were in the world of work. And another very valuable tip, I know you're running out of time. I say to people all the time, you may not be able to get the job you want right away, but surely, let's say you want to be in accounts, you're not getting a job as an accounting assistant or an accountant, but surely your temple or your church, your football club probably needs somebody to do the accounts. Volunteer, do some free work. And in doing some free work, you're helping an organization, maybe a small business, an NGO, as I said, but you're also building out your resume. So the key is really to get into that kind of mode where you're always looking for ways to build out your resume, although you're not yet in the job that you want. But helping yourself to build out your resume by doing things like this, volunteering, doing free work, just using your time wisely, these are the things that will help you in the long run when you speak with those prospective employers and you can call upon those experiences, although you may not have been at work, for a while.
And I appreciate that because sometimes there's some gaps that are just that, like blank spots. It's almost as though there's a non-disclosure agreement the information has been redacted. But that volunteering, sometimes I look at it with a little cocky eye because there's one thing in terms of paying your dues, there's another thing in terms of just like somebody telling you it's just a 5 minutes and looking at your craft. And sometimes it can feel as though you're being taken advantage of. But I think being able to do that, one, strategically, two, with intention, and looking at that spirit of volunteerism is also important because that also helps to do something that you would have described, which is building out your job or the job, working towards the job that you want on your own terms. But in the minute that we have a minute, are there any other things that might help us become a little more employable?
Yeah, definitely. Don't be afraid to take up jobs that you feel are not these are not the jobs for me. I remember a geologist telling me about taking up a job in the grocery packing bags. I would hire that geologist any day over a geologist who sat home waiting for the right job. Yeah, because he would have learned so many skills whilst doing that job, which wasn't the perfect job for him. It wasn't a job that he was looking for, but he wasn't too proud to take up a job where he would still learn something. And I would say fill those spaces, find something to do, whether you're getting paid or not. And that's going to help you prepare for the interviews that are coming around the corner.
And with that, we want to thank you so much, Bonnie Rambhajan, Education Officer for HERMAT. Thank you for the extra time as well. And on behalf of everyone looking at it now, we say thank you for tuning into the digital platforms. Have a very good one. Thank you so much for joining us.